Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Arrays. Okay, so now we discussed a little bit about, maybe why we may want to look at arrays, why arrays might be important to us. So let's talk about what an array is and try to, kind of make it a little bit easier and bring it down to really truly what we're talking about here, and why are we using an array in programming. Kind of talked about that, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. And then how do we use it? What's the part we're going to be using? And then there will be subsequent videos showing you how we use it in a program. Okay. So what is an array? So I took a couple of definitions from the internet, and an array is a series of memory locations, each of which holds a single item of data, but with each box sharing the same name. All data in the array must be the same data. That's true. An array is a collection of items stored in a continuous memory locations. The idea is to store multiple items of the same type of data. That's true also. But you as a programmer, at least right now, meaning in this particular course, don't have to worry about the memory locations. And so you can kind of discount that. Now, I say that in jest because if you get into C programming, you do learn more about the memory locations, and it is important that you understand what the memory locations are and that they're continuous. But for our sake, it really makes no difference that you understand that. We don't really concern ourselves with memory when we're talking about Visual Basic and those type of programming languages. So I like to look at things a little as simplistic as possible. So an array is a collection of like things. That's pretty much what it is. If we were sitting in a classroom, we had our computers in front of us. If you actually looked at it, they were all labeled. They were an array of computers. They were all similar. They were all alike, okay? For the most part, what we did the last couple of weeks in this particular course, we dealt with strings strings. And a string is a collection of alphanumeric characters. Those are like things. And what's really interesting is that string that we played around with was an array of characters. Really no difference. And we were able to play around with that array. And so in a lot of ways, though I never said you were doing this, you were actually playing with your first array in the previous assignments. It was just an array of characters. We take it one step further. Matter of fact, we take it a few steps further in programming, but for right now, what we're going to focus on is that we can have a collection of like variables, meaning variables that are somewhat for the same purpose, like classroom 1, classroom 2, classroom 3, but they all have to have the same data type. Okay, so in this case, if we're adding up cookies in a classroom, they're all the same data type. They all be an integer or short or whatever you want to make them, okay? And so that's what an array is that we have something, a collection of something that is of the same type and the same data type programmatically, okay? We can then, instead of dealing with them on the individual basis, we can look at them as a grouping, okay? And then with that grouping, give it one big name, that big group, and then we can reference each piece, each element, is what we're going to call these things, okay? Each element individually, utilizing an index, okay? So I kind of gave away how we use them, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Why are we using them? Well, to make our programming life a little more simple. Like I think the example that I gave you kind of showed the purpose of an array. There's all kinds of purposes. As a matter of fact, every situation you're going to walk into, you will find different purposes where an array can come into play. You don't need to force the issue. You don't need to force putting arrays into your program. Some programs you'll write, you might write 100 programs and never have an array in it. But there's going to come times when you're going to sit back and see where an array can actually come into and be beneficial to you, okay? So, at this point in your programming career, and you're instead of looking at things, this is another tool. This is another tool in your arsenal that you should be thinking about based upon the problem, based upon what you're doing. And so, you need to understand how to learn about what an array is, and then when the situation comes about, being able to apply it. And you'll recognize when to apply it because you're going to be doing things like writing a ton of lines of code. And then maybe you'll sit back and say, that array thing, do I have like things here I could put into something and process accordingly? That's where it'll come into play. Back in the day, I always like saying that, back in the day when I was young, we used arrays for a lot of more things, okay? Back when I started in programming, way back when, it seems like, and for you it probably is, um, I/O from a database was very, very slow, and in some cases we didn't even have databases. All our data was literally on tapes, and so our programs in a lot of cases would go read data from the tapes, and to get it into memory, we would put it in what was called an array. We actually, back in those days, called them tables. Almost like what you call a database table today. We would make tables in our programs, which is the same concept as an array, and then we would be in memory and we would process it. We couldn't put all the data in there because there was limitations on how we would do this, so we would go back and forth. But basically, our goal is to maximize the speed of our programs. And back in the day, where hardware was much more expensive, much more slow, not nearly as big, it was a balancing act for what we needed to do. And we did concern ourselves with memory and did concern ourselves with, CPU time and so on. In today's world, we really don't do that because, I/O is very fast. RAM is excessive, in the amount of memory you now have in RAM. And the speed of things is much more greater and only getting faster by the day. So we don't really need to do some of the things I did way back when with arrays. And today it really just comes down to using arrays to make your programs a little bit easier and less, convoluted with a lot of code that you may not need. Again, the situation has to present itself. And so don't force this issue, but you should learn how to recognize these issues as we continue to play with these throughout the remainder of this course and really the remainder of the curriculum in your career. Okay? Uh, so today they were used to when you have something in common, like variables, like I said. So instead of dealing with the individual variable, you can make them into an array and deal them as a whole. That's really what we're talking about here. So a string is a similar type of piece where a string was literally an array of characters. Now what we're going to do is have an array of variables and go from there. So how do we use it? Well, I want to show you in examples in the next video on how to walk through and actually build an array. It's fairly simple, and again, it's very logical. You got to understand the logic behind it. But for the most part, we got to declare an array. That's pretty easy. So what we're going to be doing here is instead of declaring 10 classrooms individually, we're going to be declaring one array with multiple elements. So each element would be that variable that you would have declared individually. So we're going to say we're going to declare an array and make it give me 10 elements. And so each one of those elements will basically allow for that. We'll still have those 10 different memory locations, and it'll all be sized based upon the data type of the array. That's why everything has to be the same data type. So if I can declare an array as an integer with 10 data types, it would give me 10 different elements, almost in a way create 10 different variables that would that in that array. Okay, so no different than me declaring 10 variables in my program. I can declare an array with 10 elements and so on. It's one line of code versus those 10. In this little example here, what it's doing, if you don't look at the index, this is an array where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different elements in it, okay? So instead of declaring 5 different variables, like int number 1, int number 2, int number 3, int number 4, and int number 5, we have in here number, okay? And that's the name of the array. And so when we declared this, we said it literally had 5 elements in it. And I'll show you how to do that. We need to also understand how to access these elements. So this is part you must get used to. And we're going to access them using this piece called the index. You were introduced to this last week in string manipulation. Okay? 0, once again, is the first element, then 1, then 2, and so on. Just like this piece right here. If I need to get to this element, this represents something of a number, 0 is the location. And we're going to utilize this index to point to it. I'll show you how to do that when we kind of get into it. That's actually the key to it all. We need to process the array, a little bit different than maybe accessing the array. We need to walk through the array. And usually what we do is we take an array and we walk through it and do something with it, okay? Well, we're going to do the same here. Remember when we walk through that string to find the vowels? It's the same thing here. We're going to walk through an array, incrementing the index and looking at each element to possibly add, compare, or whatever it is we need to be doing in our processing. That's pretty much it. It's very similar to what you did in that string manipulation if you understood all that. All right? So why do we use an array again? To eliminate all this code. Instead of this repetition of code, and we talked about this in my previous example, you can now go ahead and create a loop to walk through it. We wouldn't have different names of the variables. We'll just have an array with an index associated with it. And it's going to end up being a loop, literally those 5 lines of code. All right? Anyway, in the end, it's pure logic. It's another tool, okay? I remember when at my first programming class and we talked about arrays, scared me to death. I'm thinking we're talking about something in outer space or whatever, and so on. My professor was not that good, not nearly as good as the one you have. And so, but in the end, once I realized that arrays are not hard, it's just putting like variables together, grouping them under one name, and then looping through them to access the different ones. And once you get a hang of this, man, it's pretty easy, and man, your programming becomes much more powerful. Okay? All right? And you're going to save yourself a lot of time, a lot of code, and a lot of testing, and so on. All right? That's when it's all good. All right? So let's go write the interesting problem with an array and see how this all works.